You are now listening to a podcast made in collaboration with the Copenhagen College Radio.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 80 of the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at the University of Copenhagen. Connect with the show on Twitter by following us at SMNP Podcast, or swing over to our website, socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all, thanks so much for tuning in. Now, you might have noticed that I like to introduce the show by saying how social media is changing the political game. And within academia, one of the fields that really treats politics as a game of positioning and a strategic game is that of international relations. And in this episode, I'm going to be speaking to one of the premier academics in international relations, and that is Dr. Ben O'Loughlin. He is a professor in international relations at the Royal Holloway University of London, and his research in the past couple years has been really dealing with opening up a research paradigm around strategic narrative. And the argument and the theory that Dr. O'Loughlin has been working on together with his colleagues Laura Rossell and Alastair Miskimmon is that narrative, how it is both formed and projected in a communication environment, helps explain major dynamics in international affairs. And the interesting part of that quote, I think, is that it acknowledges that narrative takes place within a communication environment. The media systems, the technological infrastructures that support and promote today's media environment. And that's a really crucial aspect to consider. On the one hand, you have the narrative. On the other hand, you have the communication ecology. So in this episode, we're going to break down the concept of strategic narrative, talk about what it is and how it relates to the communication ecology, talk about how it relates to concepts of hard and soft power, and empirically, we'll look at some of Dr. O'Loughlin's work around the 2015 Iran deal and nuclear policy, and how strategic narratives were crafted on the one hand, but then also how the media environment impacted their reception on the other. So great stuff. And I just wanted to say that I think it was a year ago, one of you guys tweeted me after our episode looking at heads of state on Instagram saying there should be more podcasts about international relations and digital diplomacy. So this podcast goes out to you. I hope you're listening. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Ben O'Loughlin. He is a professor of international relations at Royal Holloway, University of London. Dr. O'Loughlin, thanks for taking the time out and coming on the Social Media and Politics podcast.
A pleasure, Michael.
So let's start out here, and we're at a conference, so we'll keep it focused. And I want to ask you about your work on strategic narrative and the concept of strategic narrative. Yeah. Can you give us kind of a brief introduction into what that is and sort of how it's important in the communication ecology and international relations?
Okay, so the concept comes out of a debate happening in London in the mid-2000s, where you have the war on terror, you have this notion of a battle of the narratives developing with Al-Qaeda. And so there were lots of people doing strategic communication in academia, but also in the private sector, who were talking about narratives and narrative battles all the time. And as scholars of communication and international relations, it was driving me and some of my colleagues mad, because basically they weren't analysing narratives, they were analysing kind of skirmishes of communication in a very short-term way. And we thought this was really a shame, because for us, there are narratives of the whole international system that determine how different affairs play out, how great powers rise and fall, how different issues are treated. And so for us, the idea of narrative is something that can get at much, much more than these kind of tactical battles with particular terrorist groups. So we developed this agenda to look at how actors narrate the system, but also the role of the information infrastructure in determining who gets to narrate. And so for us, there's kind of two levels to this game. There are narratives playing out on particular issues around climate change or global finance or migration and so on. But there are also narratives about how the communication infrastructure should be in the first place. And if you can kind of determine the nature of the system itself within which all communication happens, then that is going to skew and shape who has the power to narrate on particular issues. So there's this kind of two-level game being played. So we're interested in the kind of strategic efforts to create an international system, including its communication infrastructure, and the narrative battles, if you like, around particular issues within that communication infrastructure.
So let's kind of parse that out a bit. So on the one hand, you have these narratives, and I have some more questions about those in a second. But this communication infrastructure that the narratives happen, what do you mean by the infrastructure?
I mean the whole kind of media ecology in the widest sense. So the nature of the internet in different countries, and these days we've got very different Russian internet, European internet, American internet, Chinese, and so on. The continued prevalence and almost primacy of mainstream media in most countries for most news consumers, as well as just our everyday media uses with our phones, but also the information infrastructure around climate and science and the kind of seismic data that feeds into anything around nuclear policy or all the information we have on global health. So there's kind of the old sort of traditional view of the media that then got bolstered, the media and the internet. But for us, it's a much broader range. So when we're looking at narratives around nuclear policy, which is what I'll talk about today, there's so much open source information about what missiles are flying where that is freely available, or what stuff is being stockpiled in what countries, or which scientists know what, which isn't coming through the media, but is part of the conversation around nuclear policy. So we're trying to take this in the most holistic sense possible.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things, reading your work, and I think something that's part of international relations broadly, is it's such a state to state kind of really zoomed out look, whereas a lot of stuff that I'm working on is like election by election, so it's kind of micro, and you're looking at this macro level. And I was wondering if you could take, for some of our listeners who are not into international relations, this idea of hard power and soft power and where strategic narrative fits into that, because I think it's really crucial to understand.
Okay, so by hard power, usually we would refer to coercion, whether through military means or through economic means like sanctions, ways in which you compel behavior through whatever instruments you've got. And then soft power is for neither power of attraction. So this is using your kind of cultural engagements, and it should be the opposite of coercion. Now, our problem with the soft power concept, and I say this as the lead advisor on Britain's Soft Power Committee, I think it's a bogus concept because it's impossible to measure. And we, most Western countries right now have got soft power commissions and indexes and indices, and we're all trying to measure this thing, and it can't be done, and I is quite open about this as well, because it's very hard to tell what difference you've made to the attraction of your country to others. There's so many reasons why a foreign audience might find your country attractive. But what we can do is we can get at the stories people tell about your country. That's much more tangible. Narratives have structural properties. We can look at the setting people put your country in, the kind of sequence of events that they think formed your country and might be where it's going in the future. That is empirically accessible. And so from that, you can make inferences about attraction or about what coercive acts they think should be happening in the world. But that for us is a much more robust grounding or foundation for any kind of analysis of who is influencing whom in the international system.
Yeah, and when you talk about these state actors using narratives, a lot of times you refer to their influence in overseas audience, so not so much the domestic audience. So I wanted to ask you about that. What's the importance of a politician or a head of state using narrative to influence someone overseas rather than their domestic audience?
So this was one of the classic questions during the War on Terror, because the American government, the British government, every European government, and Indonesia and Singapore, everywhere, were trying to say something about Al-Qaeda and say something about what's happening in the Middle East without offending their domestic, American Muslims or British Muslims or Dutch Muslims or whatever. So there was this kind of, how can we say one thing to an external audience without upsetting our internal audience? And for us, that's one of the really fascinating things you can get at through strategic narrative research. You can see how leaders try to craft stories for multiple audiences at the same time, and how they sometimes say, well, we can't please all the people all the time, so we know that 20% of our electorate aren't going to like this, but we can handle that. It's worth it to create the right impression abroad, because that's going to put pressure on the government overseas by influencing their public, and that's going to bring benefits to the national interest. So that's another thing we think this kind of strategic narrative research opens up.
And is that particularly, I think it's interesting that this sort of research came out of the Al-Qaeda and the sort of terrorism thing, and so therefore somehow connected to religion, which obviously transcends national borders. So is that sort of one of the primary focuses that you've been looking at, is the religious aspect, or is it also more applicable to everyday sort of policy making and things like that?
I think it's more applicable to everyday policy making. The religious aspect of narratives was relevant when looking at Al-Qaeda or Islamic State or US foreign policy sometimes, but broadly we're more interested in the wider range. So even with our research on Al-Qaeda and Islamic State narratives, they draw on grievances about poverty and social exclusion and criminalization of communities in Europe and North America. So the actual religious aspect is usually, just a fragment of those narratives.
And so we talked a little bit about the media ecology, but how does social media fit in for these actors to promote strategic narratives? Because I think if you listen to digital marketers, there's always talk about storytelling, and we have stories literally in Instagram and Facebook. So for you, how is social media and this sort of ability to go around traditional media in some cases, how is that used by actors in terms of implementing their strategic narratives?
Well, we still see a lot of top-down hierarchical communication, particularly on international relations issues. So anything to do with finance or global security, the role of kind of bottom-up citizen-led narratives is lesser than for civil unrest or kind of more local political issues. So what we find is on matters of global terrorism or finance, the sort of old school legacy journalists are still crucially important gatekeepers. So the talk I'm going to give today about the Iran deal in 2015, it was the kind of main protagonists, the main diplomats on each side, so Kerry in America and Zarif in Iran, or Obama and Rouhani as kind of presidential peers. They were able to kind of keep the right journalists in the room that would make sure that their national debates were sort of heading in the right direction. So old school media was really important. But they also used social media themselves. So they would retweet each other. So Kerry would retweet Zarif, and even the Ayatollah in Iran would be retweeting his president or sometimes some of the European leaders. So they created another kind of elite bubble of sort of social media momentum, this sense that, we're making progress. Look, here we are meeting here we are shaking hands here I am in a white coat because I know my science, even though I'm a diplomat. They created this kind of visual momentum on social media that, again, the main journalists reproduced because that's all they were getting from the top, and they were able to kind of coordinate. So social media in a lot of international relations issues is not that disruptive right now. Leaders have learned how to play the game to a certain extent. I mean, you've got what Russia is doing as a more of a troll state, which is a bit out there, and no one's quite sure how to deal with that yet. But everyone else is being fairly, things haven't changed that much.
Yeah, it's interesting because we actually have some listeners, I know from Twitter, who've been tweeting, who are really interested in public diplomacy and digital diplomacy. And you're in a perfect spot to talk a little bit about this, which is the use of social media, whether it's in tweeting from meetings or trying to broadcast out these strategic narratives and influence public opinion. But if I read you right, you're saying that it's not so disruptive, or how does it factor into the sort of public diplomacy game?
It doesn't have to be disruptive, and it depends who you're trying to influence as well, because a lot of the time in public diplomacy, you are in theory trying to influence foreign publics, but it might be because we know kind of how network effects work, we know how influencers and intermediaries work. Often with public diplomacy campaigns, you're trying to target particular sort of semi-elite figures or people who can act as gatekeepers within that foreign society. And so that isn't rocket science, and that's not something that's especially new. We've been trying to, certainly in my country, Britain, we've been trying to target foreign elites, get them to come study in our universities, then go back home and think well of us. And really that kind of cascade model through nodal figures, we've been doing that for hundreds of years. It's magnified on the internet, but the principle is exactly the same. So I think that there was a lot of apprehension from diplomats about digital diplomacy about a decade ago, but enough of them have got their heads around how to do it now that it's become institutionalized, I think.
How important do you think it is for heads of state I mean, obviously image control is important and social media plays into that. But I'm thinking, on the one hand, let's say you have a very crafted narrative, you're trying to influence an overseas audience or a domestic audience. How important do you think the kind of thinking about leaders who have professional photographers and, or they use sort of innovative things like selfie sticks and 360 video and all these crazy things. I mean, do you think that is somehow more important, this image control, to go along with the narrative? Mm-hmm. Like how do those two things, because I think with social media you have, thinking about the American election right now, you have, candidates with more or less policies, usually less policies, but the image becomes so much more important. So how do you see those two things, the visual aspect, in terms of reaffirming a narrative or going alongside it? I mean, can you uncouple those, or are they kind of tied together these days?
Yeah, I mean, we have found through many of our studies that political leaders and diplomats are much more willing to take a risk in their digital diplomacy when they are in a weak position at the bargaining table. They need to shake things up and change the game a bit. So we found in the Iran deal negotiations, when it was President Ahmadinejad and President Bush in the 2000s, things were going really badly. And Ahmadinejad would just do crazy things. He would send open letters to Bush saying, "Brother, we are both leaders of God's countries and we have all of these things in common." And it was just quite unorthodox diplomacy. And he was putting this all up there on the internet in multiple languages because things were going badly and he wasn't getting any traction. Whereas when diplomacy is going well, when leaders are cooperating, then there's no need to take risks because you're producing the right image, because you're producing images of cooperation. Journalists will remediate that. There's nothing challenging your image. So if we go back to Dan Hallin's theory of indexing, basically if leaders are cooperating and there's a sort of sphere of consensus around an issue, then the mainstream media will follow that because they don't have any dissent to report. And so you have kind of control of the image, if you like. It's only when things are fragmented that people take risks. You also have in digital diplomacy just so many different diplomats with different personalities and characters that some of them are just by disposition more prone to experiment because they enjoy it. And so if you have 200 ambassadors for 200 countries, you're going to find that 3 or 4 of them are doing the cutting edge stuff, and whatever is the next app, they'll be on it first. Whereas 197 of them will be thinking, oh, hang on a minute, I'm not sure about that. But as long as those ambassadors aren't sort of the ambassador for Russia or China or something, really significant, then it broadly seems that state departments are saying, okay, well, play around with it because we can learn from this, and we have to experiment just as every industry has to experiment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Which platforms do you think are the most important for public diplomacy? Is it Twitter? That's the one that comes to kind of mind because it's, with the press and everything, or are there others that are also being adopted or used?
It depends on who you're trying to target. So we just did an analysis of the British Council. They did a whole year of a cultural diplomacy campaign called Shakespeare Lives on the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death. And so they wanted to show that Shakespeare was global, and that was going to play into kind of Britain's image. So they used VK in Russia, Weibo in China. Whatever was the platform for whatever country, then they would target it. So it's not like, this is where international relations is maybe a bit different from domestic politics. You have to work on the platforms of whatever society you're looking to. And that means, again, taking risks because your diplomat in London doesn't really know how Weibo works. And so they have to bring people in to advise. But you have to go where the audience is and be authentic in what counts as authentic on that platform. So what counts as authentic on Facebook doesn't work on Instagram. So you have to have the savvy to be able to adjust your, this is the transmedia storytelling thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm thinking about this idea of strategic narratives, and I think in your work you're careful to point out that this is how humans sort of fundamentally categorize information. Like we think through narratives, and I'm thinking as an American who is probably, I think the U.S. has some of the most strongest narratives in terms of American dream and these types of things. And on the one hand, I'm thinking about isn't it in international relations isn't it a bit manipulative to have these strategic narratives and to try to influence thinking? Yet, if I think about a sort of American identity, I can pull up a ton of narratives that I actually enjoy, like American Dream or working for something, these sorts of things, freedom, these types of ideas that, I mean, I love thinking through these lenses, but I'm also thinking, am I sort of manipulated by these narratives? Or do you see it as almost, it's strategic, but is it not manipulative in the end?
Well, that's politics. Politics is agonistic, and we're trying to get what we want. But we are very careful with the concept of strategic, and we really have to unpack when a narrative is being used strategically and when it's just out there floating freely. So something like the Enlightenment or the Cold War or Clash of Civilizations, often they're not being used strategically, they're just being used descriptively in a common sense way to say, well, this is how the world is. Other times, leaders, or even us as individuals, pick a particular narrative that we think will lead people to think in a certain way, to create expectations about what's likely to happen. Because narrative is all about creating this experience of the world as being part of a historical transition from A to B, with hopefully a happy ending. And so often we're not trying to put people into that experience, but in politics we are, because we're wanting them to align their goals with where we want to go. And so you can call that manipulative. I would just call that being political. As long as you're not coercing them and kind of locking them in a room, forcing them to write out that narrative for 20 years, then I think that's part of the game.
And one last question for you, which is, you have in international relations, you typically focus on heads of state or other actors that are really kind of moving at the top level. But I think one of the things that the internet and social media has changed is this ability for, whether it's just individual people or influencers, to also put forth their narrative and perhaps also an alternative or counter narrative. So how do you see that working? I mean, I guess you have the mainstream media in the middle that kind of works there, but when you have this opening up of the public, that's kind of an interesting voice, a collective voice or an individual voice to challenge these narratives. So how do you see that opening up of the public into the public sphere in terms of narratives?
Our colleague Sean Powers in the US State Department, I think right now, has this metaphor where suddenly the internet has lifted the carpet on the full range of the people's narratives. So it used to be in the kind of broadcast era and mass public opinion polling that we would kind of see the middle, but the fringes, those voices couldn't speak in the public domain because they were outside of the mainstream. Whereas the internet is kind of lifted that, and now everybody's narratives are out there. And suddenly we see more conspiratorial narratives, we see more extreme, suddenly we see these bubbles that have always been there. It's just, if you were in a filter bubble in the 1960s, that meant you would talk to people down the pub about your crazy ideas, but you couldn't go on TV and broadcast them. But those crazy ideas haven't just suddenly appeared since the internet. We just see them more. And so for us as scholars of political communication and international relations, that's both a kind of scary thing and a really good opportunity. So it's scary because we do see this polarization that had kind of been a little bit hidden from us. And we do have to do more time researching extremist narratives that are quite unpleasant, things that affect us as researchers and things we have to think carefully ethically about. But we also have the full range of often what are quite productive narratives and narratives where people have been in communities facing trouble and they've seen that trouble off and they've been resilient and they've learned how to act politically in their communities. And so there's this kind of, in international relations, there's a lot of focus right now on everyday narratives, narratives from below, if you like. And a lot of them are very positive, and the fact that we can access them makes international relations more inclusive. So we've had strategic narrative studies of women's groups in Burundi, how they've mobilized and how they've used narrative strategically, not in a manipulative way, but they had some real problems and they had to mobilize and they had to use language to get themselves going and to appeal to others. So there's this much more diversity in the range of narratives we can study in international relations. It's not just the leaders' narratives and the Kissinger's narratives or whatever anymore. It's this real plurality. But some of that's scary and some of that's empowering and inspiring, and we have to deal with all of that.
Actually, a follow-up question, which is, I'm thinking you mentioned women, I think of the Me Too movement. And I mean, that's one, an example of a narrative that I think, or correct me if I'm wrong, that really kind of this everyday narrative, I guess, from the bottom that leaders had to respond to. And it's really locked up quite a few of them, or got them in trouble in terms of their how they would normally promote narratives. So I'm wondering, like, how does that square in terms of an everyday narrative that I think really has to be responded to by elites? Do you see that dynamic?
Yeah. And the elites have to work out what the narrative is there, and it's not always easy for them. So with the Me Too movement, it's such a ambiguous little hashtag, because what that means to different people, there's a billion meanings there. And how that gets articulated from that aggregate into some, movement with a single narrative is really, there isn't a single narrative. And so elites are sort of thrown off guard because they need to speak often with a singular policy. They have to make a policy. And so this becomes really, really difficult for them, and in a good way, because it forces them to account for a range of experiences and problems and narratives. But that's something, I suppose we need to think about, how would that be different from the civil rights protests in the 60s? Because you also had a range of experiences and suffering and narratives that came out of that then, and that they got articulated through movements too. It's just with different network effects because the communication structure was different. Right. So I think what we probably need right now is a lot more kind of comparative historical work to see both how these networks organize and mobilize, and how that gets fitted into political systems of decision-making accountability.
I guess that idea of the infrastructures you were talking about at the beginning, right?
Yeah, it comes back to that.
Longitudinal comparisons can maybe tease that out.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have a 2-day workshop ahead of us. So thank you so much, Dr. Laughlin, for taking the time out and coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Michael.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Ben O'Loughlin, Professor of International Relations at Royal Holloway, University of London. And that'll do it for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Depending on when you hear this, the European Parliament elections are just about to be underway or over, so expect some content coming out on that. Remember, you can sign up for the newsletter at socialmediaandpolitics.org. Connect with us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Copenhagen. See you next time.